They thought he was just another delivery guy, until their boss walked in. The air inside the office was stiff, not from tension, but from routine. Phones rang, keyboards clacked, and conversations hummed in the background. It was just another Tuesday afternoon at Westbridge Solutions, a mid-sized tech firm in Indianapolis that had recently been acquired by a larger company. Most of the employees weren't too concerned about the change in ownership, at least not yet. The glass doors swung open, and in walked a man wearing a grey hoodie and dark jeans, a medium-sized box tucked under one arm. His steps were slow and deliberate as he took in the space, observing everything, the sleek workstations, the modern open concept design, the employees too busy in their own worlds to pay him much attention. Well, most of them. From the front desk, Lisa, the office receptionist, glanced up from her phone, barely giving him a second look before sighing. "Deliveries go through the back." The words weren't spoken with hostility, but they carried an unmistakable tone. Dismissal. The man stopped, tilting his head slightly, as if giving her a chance to correct herself. She didn't. Instead, she tapped a pen against the desk impatiently, waiting for him to turn around and do as he was told. Before he could respond, another voice cut in from the side. "Hope it's the new office supplies," one of the employees muttered, not even bothering to look up from his screen. Another, a guy in a button-up shirt, leaned back in his chair and chuckled. "Took long enough. We've been waiting on that order for weeks." The man with the box exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the Westbridge Solutions logo hanging on the wall behind the receptionist, then shifted his attention back to Lisa. "I'm not with the delivery service," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. Lisa arched a brow, barely interested. "Oh, well, what do you need then?" Before he could answer, another interruption. A man in his late 40s, wearing a tucked-in polo and khakis, walked over with an expression that screamed mild irritation. His name badge read, "Sam Richardson, Supervisor." "Didn't we already tell you guys? We don't sign for stuff this late. Just leave it and go." The dismissiveness was loud and clear now. Not one person had stopped to ask who he was or why he was there. They had already decided who he was. The man adjusted his grip on the box, shifting its weight slightly, but didn't move. Lisa crossed her arms. "Look, man, we don't have time for this." But before she could finish, a door at the far end of the office swung open. A well-dressed man in a tailored suit stepped out, his phone in hand. He glanced up, about to say something when his eyes landed on the man with the box. His entire demeanor changed instantly. The color drained from his face, and he stiffened as if he'd just seen a ghost. His phone nearly slipped from his hand. "Mr. Coleman," he stammered, disbelief heavy in his voice. Silence fell over the office. The employees who had been so quick to dismiss him suddenly found themselves looking at one another, realization creeping in like a slow-burning fire. The man, Elliot Coleman, CEO of the company that now owned Westbridge Solutions, finally set the box down on the counter. He leaned forward just slightly, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Well," he said, letting his words hang for a moment. "I just wanted to see how things were running here. Looks like I've already learned a lot. But now it was time to see just how deep the problem ran. The room felt different now. The air, once casual and filled with chatter, had grown heavy with realization. The silence stretched, swallowing the confidence that had filled the space just moments ago. Lisa's arms dropped from their crossed position, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. The supervisor, Sam, shifted his weight, suddenly far less sure of himself. The employee who had joked about the delivery? He was now pretending to be focused on his screen, but his fingers weren't moving. Elliot Coleman took his time. He let the moment simmer, giving them just enough space to sit with their mistake before speaking again. I came to see how things were operating on the ground, he said, his voice level, unreadable. But it seems like there's an issue at the front door. The regional manager, Daniel Whitaker, a man who had been with the company for over a decade, finally found his voice. Mr. Coleman, I had no idea you were stopping by today, he said quickly, forcing a strained smile. If we had known Elliot tilted his head slightly. Would have treated me differently? Daniel's mouth opened, then closed. Lisa, still standing behind the reception desk, finally spoke, though her voice lacked the confidence it had before. I didn't mean anything by it. Didn't you? Elliot asked, his tone almost casual. Lisa blinked, thrown off by the question. I thought you were a delivery guy. Because I was carrying a box. Well, yeah. Elliot glanced at the box still sitting on the counter, then back at her. And if I were wearing a suit? Lisa's lips pressed together, as if she knew there was no good answer. But before she could say anything, Sam, the supervisor, finally stepped forward, clearing his throat. Look, he said, his tone trying to regain control of the situation. This was just a misunderstanding. It happens. No harm, no foul. Elliot's brows lifted slightly. No harm, huh? He gestured to the room, where every employee was still frozen, watching with wide eyes. Seems like there's plenty of harm to go around. Sam exhaled sharply, as if annoyed. I don't see what the big deal is. People make assumptions all the time. Elliot studied him for a moment, then took a step closer, his voice lowering just enough that everyone had to lean in to hear. Tell me something, Sam. When the last delivery person came in, did you tell them to leave and go before they could even explain why they were here? Sam's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Did you assume they weren't worth your time? Elliot pressed, watching him carefully. That their presence didn't matter? Sam shifted uncomfortably but still tried to keep his tone even. I don't see how this has anything to do with business, Mr. Coleman. Elliot let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. It has everything to do with business. The weight of those words settled over the room, pressing down like a stone, because now the real conversation was about to begin. A few uneasy shuffles echoed in the room. No one dared to speak, but their eyes darted back and forth, some waiting for Elliot Coleman to drop the hammer, others hoping this would all just blow over. But Elliot? He was in no rush. He turned back to the box sitting on the counter, running a hand across the top of it. Then, without looking up, he asked, How long have you been here, Sam? The supervisor stiffened. Almost 8 years. Elliot nodded slowly. 8 years. That's a long time. Long enough to know how to run an office. Long enough to know how to treat people. Sam's mouth tugged into a tight frown. Look, Mr. Coleman. No, you look, Elliot interrupted, finally lifting his gaze. His expression was calm, but there was weight behind his words. I don't care how long you've worked here. I care about what kind of environment you've allowed to exist under your leadership. Sam opened his mouth, then closed it, his confidence starting to crack. Elliot gestured toward Lisa, then toward the employees who had so quickly dismissed him earlier. The moment I walked in, I was treated like I didn't belong, like my presence was a problem. None of you knew who I was, and yet you made a decision about my value in this space before I even said a word. Lisa shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. And here's the part that should concern you, Sam, Elliot continued, his tone still measured, but firm. If this is how you treat a stranger with no information, what does that say about how you treat your employees? About how you judge their worth? Sam exhaled through his nose, clearly frustrated, but unable to argue. Still, he tried. We didn't mean any harm. It's not like we told you to leave because of... Elliot raised a hand, cutting him off. Don't even finish that sentence." Sam clamped his mouth shut. Elliot sighed, rubbing his temples briefly before speaking again. "Intentions don't matter nearly as much as impact. Whether you meant it or not, you dismissed me. You saw a guy in a hoodie carrying a box, and you assumed I wasn't worth your time." Lisa finally spoke up, her voice small. "I was just doing my job." Elliot turned toward her, his voice softer now. "Were you?" Lisa swallowed. "Tell me something," he said, his tone more measured now. "If I had been wearing a suit, if I had walked in here with a briefcase instead of a box, would you have reacted the same way?" Lisa hesitated. Elliot nodded, as if her silence was enough of an answer. "That's the problem." He turned back to the rest of the office, where employees were still watching, listening, absorbing every word. "This isn't just about me," he said, addressing the entire room now. "It's about the culture in this office. About the kind of workplace you've all contributed to. About who gets treated with respect and who doesn't." Sam rubbed a hand over his jaw, finally starting to understand that this wasn't something he could just brush off. And Elliot? He could see it. The moment where realization turned into accountability. But this wasn't over yet. Because now it was time to see what they were going to do about it. The silence stretched so long it became suffocating. No one dared to move. No one knew what to say. The weight of Elliot's words had settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Uncomfortable, undeniable, inescapable. Sam shifted from foot to foot, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. Lisa was suddenly hyper-aware of her own breathing, her hands gripping the edge of the desk like it could somehow keep her steady. Daniel, the regional manager, finally cleared his throat, his voice tight. "Mr. Coleman, I assure you, this isn't how we normally operate here." Elliot just looked at him, steady, silent, unimpressed. Daniel continued, fumbling over his words. "We value professionalism and inclusivity. This was a mistake. A misunderstanding." Elliot exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "A misunderstanding." He repeated the words like he was tasting them, as if he were rolling them around in his mouth to see if they sat right. They didn't. His gaze swept the room again. "A misunderstanding is getting someone's name wrong. A misunderstanding is misplacing a file. This..." He gestured to himself, to the box, to the employees still trying to look busy at their desks. This was something else. Lisa finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to offend you." Elliot's eyes landed on her. "But you did." She looked away. "And not just me," Elliot continued, turning his attention to the entire room. "Every single person who's ever walked into this office and been dismissed, overlooked, assumed to be less than what they are." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some were still too stunned to react. Others were just now realizing the bigger picture. Sam finally crossed his arms, his voice strained but defensive. "So what? Are you saying we're all bad people? That we're all just discriminatory?" Elliot studied him for a moment, then leaned in slightly, his voice lower, firmer. "I'm saying that how you treat people when you think they have nothing to offer you tells me everything I need to know." Sam's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Lisa's eyes flickered toward the other employees, as if searching for someone, anyone, to jump in and defend her. But no one did. They were all still processing. Elliot sighed, his fingers tapping against the counter for a moment before he continued. "I don't care about apologies. I don't need excuses. What I need is to know one thing." The room was still, waiting. "What are you going to do about it?" Sam opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't have an answer. Daniel, the regional manager, cleared his throat again. Mr. Coleman, I think we need to have a serious conversation about our office culture, about our training, about— You're damn right we do. Elliot cut him off, but there was no anger in his voice, just certainty, authority, finality. He picked up the box from the counter again, this time holding it like it carried something far heavier than office supplies. I wasn't planning to stay long today. His voice was even, but his eyes were sharp. But after what I just experienced, I think I'll be coming back a lot more often. The employees stiffened. Lisa looked like she was barely breathing. Sam's jaw tightened, but he didn't say another word. Elliot turned toward Daniel. There will be changes. Mandatory training, leadership evaluations, and some personnel adjustments. And trust me when I say, if I see even a hint of this kind of behavior again— His grip on the box tightened slightly. Some of you won't have a job to come back to. A few gasps slipped out, small but audible. Sam looked down, no longer willing to meet Elliot's gaze. Lisa's face was flushed, her hands trembling slightly as she finally seemed to understand. This wasn't just a bad moment. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Elliot shifted the box under his arm and glanced at the rest of the office one last time. I'll see myself out. Then, just like that, he turned and walked toward the exit, the room still so silent you could hear the air conditioning humming. But just before he reached the door, he stopped. Without turning around, he spoke one last time. Respect isn't something you only give when it's convenient. And with that, he left them to sit with what they had done. The glass door shut behind him, but the weight of his presence remained in the room like a storm cloud refusing to pass. For the first time all day, the office was completely still. No phones ringing, no keyboards clacking, no whispered conversations, just a heavy, unspoken tension thick enough to choke on. Lisa was staring at the front desk, her hand still gripping the edge like it was the only thing keeping her standing. Sam had his arms crossed tightly, his jaw set, but his usual confidence was gone. Daniel, the highest-ranking person left in the room, finally let out a slow breath and rubbed a hand over his face. We're screwed. The words came out flat, defeated. And for once, no one argued. Sam, still standing near the counter, let out a frustrated scoff. This is ridiculous. The guy walks in here, we make a mistake, and suddenly it's like we're the worst people on earth. Lisa's head snapped up. You still don't get it. Her voice was quiet, but there was something shaky underneath it, like the adrenaline was still wearing off. Sam scoffed again, shaking his head. It was an accident. Lisa exhaled, pressing her fingers to her temples. It was an accident for him. She gestured toward the door where Elliot had exited. But what about every other person we've done this to? You really think he's the first? That shut Sam up. Because the truth was, he knew. They all did. How many people had walked through those doors and been treated like they were in the way? How many job candidates, vendors, clients, delivery workers, even customers had been dismissed before they could even introduce themselves? And the worst part? Nobody had ever questioned it. Not until today. Lisa sank into her chair, her hands clasped together, as if she was just now realizing the kind of environment she had helped create. Daniel turned toward Sam, his voice low, controlled. You've been a supervisor for 8 years. Do you honestly think this is just about today? Sam clenched his jaw, but didn't respond. Daniel let out another slow exhale and shook his head. We need to fix this. Immediately. Sam's face twisted in frustration. And how exactly do you suggest we do that? You heard the man. Training, evaluations, personnel adjustments. He let out a humorless chuckle. Sounds like some of us are about to be out of a job. Nobody disagreed, because Elliot Coleman wasn't the kind of man to make empty threats. Lisa finally looked up at Daniel. What do we do?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then, with a heavy sigh, he straightened his tie and squared his shoulders. "We start by owning it." The next day, an official company-wide email was sent from Daniel's desk. It was short, direct, no excuses. It acknowledged what had happened, apologized for it, and outlined immediate changes. Mandatory leadership training focused on bias, inclusivity, and professional courtesy. New policies ensuring equal treatment of every individual who walked through the doors, regardless of their role. A zero-tolerance policy for dismissive or discriminatory behavior from anyone. And lastly, an open invitation for employees to voice concerns, share experiences, and contribute to building a workplace that actually reflected the values they claimed to have. And as for Sam Richardson, his office was empty by the end of the week. Lisa stayed, but this time she was different, more aware, more intentional, more willing to listen instead of assume. Because sometimes one moment is all it takes to reveal a problem, but fixing it, that takes work. Elliot Coleman didn't need to fire anyone to prove his point. He didn't need to yell, threaten, or demand respect. He just let them see themselves for what they were, and that was enough. Because respect isn't about who someone appears to be. It's about treating every person, no matter their title, their outfit, their job, or their status, like they belong. And if you only show respect when you think it benefits you, then you don't actually have respect for anyone at all. So the question is, how do you treat people when you think they have nothing to offer you? Because one day you might find out they were never beneath you to begin with. If this story made you think, share it, talk about it. And most importantly, start paying attention to the way you treat others, because you never know who's watching.